Ready? All right, if you would turn to the book of Matthew, chapter 14. We're in the book, in our study in the book of Matthew. Tonight we start a new chapter, of course, and then some different things about the Lord's ministry on the earth. The last chapter we saw several parables mentioned, and we discussed those. His rejection, the last part of that chapter was the rejection in Nazareth, his hometown. Tonight we're going to look at the telling of John the Baptist's death. John the Baptist is already dead at this point, but it's just Matthew retelling of the death. And I want to turn to Luke chapter 3 first, and look there just to get a little bit more background on the death of John the Baptist. So let's turn to Luke chapter 3 first, and then we'll come back to Matthew chapter 14. In Luke chapter 3 verse 1, now in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, and Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea, and the region of Trachonitis, and Lysanias, tetrarch of Abilene, and Ananias and Caiaphas being the high priest. The word of God came unto John, the son of Zacharias, in the wilderness, and he came into all the country about Jordan, preaching the baptism and repentance of the remission of sins, as it is written in the book of the words of Isaiah the prophet, saying, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make his path straight. Every valley shall be filled, and every mountain and hill shall be brought low and crooked, and the crooked shall be made straight, and the rough ways shall be made smooth, and all flesh shall see the salvation of God. And then, so we see the introduction of Luke make the introduction of John the Baptist there, and then I think it's well, if I can get my page turned. No, that's not what I was thinking about. Anyway, in Luke chapter 9, in verse 7, now Herod the Tetrarch heard of all that was done by him, and he was perplexed, because that it was said of some that John was risen from the dead, and of some that Elias had appeared, and of others that one of the old prophets was risen again. And Herod said, John have I beheaded, but who is this of whom I hear such things? And he desired to see him. So that's where we are in chapter 14 in Matthew. Jesus and his disciples have been out preaching and healing people. And now Herod, if you go back to Matthew chapter 14, where we're going to be tonight, it says, at that time Herod the Tetrarch heard of the fame of Jesus. Herod being referred to himself as king over Judah at that time. He was a Roman puppet. Well, I'm not going to get into the history of Herod too deeply, but just know that he was a puppet of Rome. Rome basically appointed him as king to satisfy the Jews, basically, to keep peace in the land, so that they didn't have trouble there as far as the Jews trying to form an uprising or anything like that. And that was the Roman way in that time, in those days. Rome would come into a country, they would conquer a country, and they would try to keep the peace, whether it was with the religious people or whoever, government officials and all that, try to keep the peace so that they didn't have trouble there and didn't have to spend extra funds and extra troops to come there and control things. They did. There were, as you know, from reading the scriptures, we know there was a large Roman influence there. They had troops there, stationed there. They had Pontius Pilate. We just read about him, and we'll see him again later. Well, no, not tonight. And later in Matthew, we'll see Pontius Pilate. He's the one who the Jews brought Jesus before for his crucifixion. But Herod the Tetrarch, it says, there was a whole line of Herods. They were kings. They were family. It was passed down from son to son, father to son. And if I remember right, there was at least 4 Herods. You had Herod the Great was king when Jesus was born, if you remember. Herod the Tetrarch was his son. He came out later. When you get to Paul, when he went to Jerusalem, and just as he was about to be sent to Rome, or on his way to Rome, he met with Herod, who was either the grandson or great-grandson of Herod the Great. So there was a whole line of them, and it was passed down passed down into the family. And also, we'll see tonight where there was also the Herod family. Herod had brothers, he had cousins, and of course they had families. They were all considered part of the Herod royalty, if you will, in Israel in that day, and they all had positions in the government. They were all rulers of the political part of the country at that time. And even though Rome was a supreme ruler there, the Jews did have somewhat control as long as they abided played by the rules. In other words, as long as they played by the rules of the Romans left them alone, pretty much. They didn't interfere with their religious practices. They didn't, as long as their religious practices didn't cause an uprising. Now, you had men like John the Baptist who came along, and it appeared as though he had a great following. Herod recognized that and had a problem with it. Herod was one of those guys that tried to keep the peace with the Romans because he knew if he lost control, there was going to be big problems. And eventually there were. In 70 AD, it all fell apart. But Herod the Tetrarch seems to have been a negotiator, if you will. He would try to keep the peace as much as he could. And when someone like John the Baptist rose up, and in this case, as Jesus began to gain fame and began to get more popular, he began to watch Jesus, and Jesus became a problem. And the reason for that is because before New Testament times, before Jesus' day, during the same time period, especially in the time of Herod the Great, there were men that would rise up every so often, and they would draw a crowd. They were, of course, false prophets. They would come claiming to be the Messiah. And there was, I forget the man's name, but there was one who gathered up a large group of Jews, and they all moved out to the wilderness and were planning an uprising. And they were a large enough group that they could have caused some big problems for the Romans. And Herod, from what I understood, I guess Herod the Great squashed that. He along with the Romans, had that man killed, and all his followers were either persecuted or killed. And so the Jews had calmed down from all that. Things were going a little bit smoother now. And then along comes John the Baptist. And what happens? Well, Matthew, from verse 2 through verse 12, Matthew tells us what happened with John the Baptist after the fact. Of course, John's already dead by this point. So verse 2 says, and said unto his servants, this is John the Baptist. Herod believed, as we read in Luke, he believed that Jesus, because of the things he was doing, that he was possibly could be John the Baptist come back from the dead. But he knew he had had John the Baptist beheaded. He knew that couldn't be possible. And so maybe he's one of the Old Testament prophets. He mentioned that in Luke, what we read in Luke. Some believed he might be even Isaiah or Moses or somebody else like that from the Old Testament. Ezekiel. There was all kinds of names floating around. Who is this man Jesus? He can't be who he says he is. He's got to be one of the prophets of old that's come back from the dead. Well, we think about that being ridiculous today, but even for the Jews in their day, that was ridiculous talk. They knew better than that. They knew that men didn't come back from the dead. They knew that was not even a possibility if they were very strong in the Jewish faith at all. Herod certainly knew that. He was raised, from what I understand, he was raised a Jew. He was not of the bloodline of David, so he was not a true king over Israel, but he certainly knew the law of the Jews inside and out. He knew that it was not possible for John the Baptist to come back from the dead. And so that's why he questioned who Jesus was. And it concerned him because he had never heard of him, didn't know who he was. He said unto his servants, this is John the Baptist. He is risen from the dead, and therefore mighty works do show forth themselves in him. Well, John the Baptist wasn't doing these mighty works that Jesus was doing. He wasn't doing all the healings and the casting out demons and those kinds of things. He was preaching repentance. He was baptizing people. He was doing some wonderful works, good works, but not the things that Jesus was doing. But he was prophesying of Jesus coming, of his coming, and telling people of his coming. And so, but Herod here thinks maybe this is John the Baptist come back. But and again, if you go back to what we read in Luke, Herod really didn't believe that. He thought about it, but it was like, well, that's not possible. It's got to be somebody else. For Herod had laid hold on John and bound him and put him in prison for Herodias' sake, his brother Philip's wife. And Philip, remember we read in Luke chapter 3 where Philip was part of the royal family, if you will. He was a governor over a certain part of the country. He had been given that responsibility as the king's brother. He was married to this woman Herodias, very wicked woman. She sought the death of John the Baptist. John, in verse 4, he says, for John, the reason he had put John in prison because of Herodias is it appears as though Herodias and Herod were having an affair, an inappropriate affair. And it was while his brother Philip was still alive. And Herod sought to marry her while she was still married to Philip. For John said unto him, it is not lawful for thee to have her. So John stood up to Herod, said, you can't have her for your wife. She's already married. And when he would have put him to death, he feared the multitude because they counted him as a prophet. So here Herod was worried. Now, again, you have a man, John the Baptist, who has a great following, a multitude, Herod, or the Herod family in the past had killed people because they feared an uprising. But if you remember, most of those stories of those people were not actually in Jerusalem itself. They were out, they had escaped, they had gone out away from Jerusalem, they had gone out into the wilderness. Here, John the Baptist had people everywhere. He had followers all over the country. And Herod had no idea where these people were. There could have been some in his own court, as far as he knew. He could have been assassinated. If that was the plan by John the Baptist, John the Baptist could have had Herod assassinated at any time. Herod had to worry about that. But that was not John the Baptist's mission. That was not what he was here for, and that's not and his people knew that. But it says they counted him as a prophet. And certainly we know John the Baptist is said to be the last prophet, the last Old Testament prophet, meaning that he's the last prophet before Christ came in the New Testament. But when Herod's birthday was kept, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod. So Herod, they have a big party for his birthday. Herodias' daughter, who is, some say she was Philip's daughter also. Some say that she wasn't, that Herodias had either multiple affairs or that she had been married before Philip. There's multiple different thoughts on that matter. It just doesn't mention her being Philip's daughter. So it appears as though she is not part of the Herod family, other than her mother being her mother's daughter, Herodias. But she danced at the party, the birthday party, and pleased Herod. It pleased him to see her dance. She danced in a provocative way, in other words, and it caught his eye. So, because this girl, and we don't know how old she was, doesn't say, because her dance was pleasing to the king, he made her a promise. And he said, whereupon he promised with an oath to give her whatsoever she would ask. So whatever she wanted was hers. You know, you want $1 million, I'll give it to you. You know, whatever you want. He had no idea what she was going to ask for. And what she asked for was not of her own asking, it was of her mother's, out of spite for John the Baptist. And she, being before instructed of her mother, said, give me here John the Baptist's head in a charger. So this was planned before. They knew what kind of man Herod was, in other words. They knew that he was driven mentally by sexual means, if you will. He had an eye for the ladies, in other words. They knew that if they put this girl up there and she danced before him, and if it was truly pleasing to him, they could get whatever they wanted out of him. And so they do. The mother, and you notice Philip is never mentioned in any of this, other than that he's Herodias' wife. We don't know much about Philip at all. Herodias is the one behind all this. She persuades her daughter to do what she did, to dance before the king at a party. And then she instructs her, you know, when he comes and tells you and promises to give you whatever you want, tell him you want John the Baptist's head. And that's how much Herodias hated John the Baptist. Herod hated him too, but Herod wasn't willing to do anything about him because he knew it would disrupt the people. Herodias didn't care. She wanted to be the queen. She wanted to be the king's wife. She was after the money, the prestige of being royalty. Her husband was the lowly king's brother, the king's lowly brother. He was, as far as royalty was concerned, he was nobody. He was not ever going to be king. Give me here John the Baptist's head in a charger. Give it to me on a platter, in other words. Remember, there's a saying out there, and maybe not used much anymore, but people used to say, give me their head on a platter. Hand me their head on a platter. That's where that comes from. And the king was sorry. King Herod didn't like it. He didn't want to do it, but he didn't have a choice. He'd made a promise. It's always funny to me that people who are wicked people, they'll lie and cheat to everybody until they make a promise. And then, I got to keep that promise. It doesn't matter how wicked it is, they're going to keep that promise that they made. But they'll lie and cheat everybody else. But when it comes to making a promise, especially when it comes to God's people, they make a promise against God's people. We got to keep that promise. But, I cheated you in every other way, but this time I'm going to keep my promise. That's kind of how Herod is. It says, nevertheless, for the oath's sake, and them which sat with him at meat, he commanded it to be given her. So he was under peer pressure here. There are other dignitaries, other people at his party. He had to make good on his promise or make himself look like a fool. That's basically what it was. And he sent and beheaded John in the prison. And his head was brought in a charger and given to the damsel, and she brought it to her mother. And we think, how gruesome is that? And certainly it is. They've killed John the Baptist now. He's no longer a problem. So they think all their worries are over with. But they've forgotten about Jesus. By the time John's dead, Jesus has already started his ministry, and he's already got multitudes following him. And a lot of the multitudes that are following Jesus are the same people that were following John. But they beheaded him in the prison. They bring his head to the girl, and she takes it to her mother as proof that John the Baptist is now dead. Now, by this, that means that they've all seen John the Baptist, and they know who he is. By looking at, when they see the head, they recognize it. They know for sure who it is. Not just the fact they didn't just bring him anybody's head. They brought the head of somebody that they knew. John the Baptist knew these people. How, it doesn't tell us, but obviously they had seen him before, enough that they knew who he was. And there was no mistake that it was John the Baptist that they murdered. Verse 12, and his disciples came and took up the body and buried it and went and told Jesus. Now this is the disciples of John the Baptist, his closest followers. They took the body and buried it. It doesn't say anything about the head. I don't know if Herod ever released the head to him or not. It doesn't say. But they buried it, and then they went and told Jesus. Why? Because they knew Jesus was the Messiah. These are disciples of John the Baptist. They knew who Jesus was. They were probably there at his baptism when John declared that he was the Son of God. Now, that's the end of the telling of John the Baptist in the book of Matthew, anyway. And certainly the end of his life. But at the same time, it's not the end of the story here. That's Matthew kind of throws this in to set up what's next, just as a time period. He says at verse 1, at that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard of the fame of Jesus. And verse 2, and said unto his servants, this is John the Baptist. That's where we started this. Herod begins hearing about Jesus. And then verses 3 through 14, or through 12, 3 through 12, if you will, it's kind of like a parenthesis. Matthew throws that in there to give some historical data. We do that all the time now, whether it's in our preaching or in our storytelling amongst each other, whatever. But this is kind of a parentheses. It's kind of, oh yeah, this is what happened. This is why Herod is concerned about Jesus and his multitudes, is because of John the Baptist. So next we see the 5,000 who are fed. And this happens, some say this happens right after the killing of John the Baptist. Some say it happens, this is the part that's, from verse 1 and 2. Then if you were to skip from 1 and 2 down to verse 13, you wouldn't be wrong, because what's in the middle there is in parentheses and a side note, if you will. So it's the time. This doesn't happen. I don't think this happens after. I don't think this happens after John the Baptist dies. Not right after John the Baptist dies. This happens after what is said in verse 2. And the reason I say that is the verse 13 has another paragraph mark there. It's the start of a new paragraph. It says, when Jesus heard of it, he departed thence by ship into a desert place apart, and when the people had heard thereof, they followed him on foot out of the cities. So, after Jesus heard that Herod was questioning who he was, Jesus gets in a ship and goes to a desert place, a place that's not, a place it's not a resort, a vacation place. It's not. It's a place where there's not much there, not much growing, not much. It's a desert, basically, is what it says, a desert place, and to get apart from everybody for a change. And when the people had heard thereof, they followed him on foot out of the cities. So out of multiple cities, the people began to follow. They knew where he was heading. They followed him. And Jesus went forth and saw a great multitude, and was moved with compassion toward them, and he healed their sick. Again, we see Jesus feeling sorry for the people. Are all these people that he healed saved? There's no evidence of that. Sometimes we see that it was the faith of a relative that someone was saved. Sometimes it was the faith of that person that was healed that was saved. That person that was healed, it was their faith, he would say. Sometimes it was their relative, a mother or father or whoever. But we don't know if everybody that he healed was saved. It doesn't tell us. We know later that many of those that followed him left him because he began to preach truth, began to preach doctrine and deep doctrine, and it puzzled them, and they couldn't stand it, and they left. Verse 15, and when it was evening, his disciples came to him, saying, this is a desert place, and the time is now past. Send the multitude away that they may go into the villages and buy themselves victuals. In other words, they need to go eat. It's late. It's past supper time. They need to go. They need to go and eat. Let them go. But Jesus said unto them, they need not depart. Give ye them to eat. We got food. Let's share with them. And they said unto him, we have here but 5 loaves and 2 fishes. We don't have much. We've barely got enough for ourselves. It doesn't tell us how big the fishes were. We know if they had flatbread, like what we would commonly call flatbread, which is similar to what they would have had, for 5 loaves, certainly that would have been enough. That with some fish would have been enough for 12 apostles and Jesus himself. There might be a few more, but that would have been it. And he said, bring them hither to me. In other words, bring me the bread and the fish. And he commanded the multitude to sit down on the grass, and took the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and brake, and gave the loaves to his disciples, and the disciples to the multitude. And they did all eat and were filled, and they took up of the fragments that remained 12 baskets full. And you think, well, how small did he break it? Well, it didn't matter how small he broke it. There were 12 baskets full left over. That's a lot of food that was left over. Here we see another miracle. A miracle that nobody, these people have never seen things like this, that Jesus, the things that Jesus was doing, the miracles that he was performing, that they had never seen anybody perform these things before. Even all the false prophets who had come up before, who would claim to be the Messiah that we talked about earlier, they never performed these things. John the Baptist didn't perform these things. John prophesied that there was one coming that would. But even as great as John the Baptist was, he was not the Messiah. And they that had eaten were about 5,000 men, beside women and children. So he didn't even count the women and children. There was about, it says, 5,000 men. We have no idea how many women and children, and there's been all kinds of guesses. People will say, well, if each man had a wife, well, we don't know that. Each man may not have been married. They may have been single. They may have been widowers, beside women and children. With the women, there could have been women who were widows. There could have been women who were not married. Who knows? We don't. Maybe they were there with their husbands. Maybe they weren't. Maybe their husbands weren't there. And children. Well, did each woman have one child, or did she have 8 or 10 children? We don't know. The number is endless there. We have no idea how many. You would think, the way this is worded here, there was at least 10,000 total there. We hear the stories, and I know we learn all. I'm sure most of us learned it in Sunday school. The tell about the 5,000 that were fed. There was more than 5,000. And even here in my Bible, it titles each section, and the title of this section is the 5,000 fed. The miracle was much greater than 5,000. There was way more than 5,000 there. We don't know how many. There could have been just 2 women and 2 children. It's plural. It says beside women and children. But I think if that was the case, I think he would have told us, because it was a small number. But it appears as though there was a great multitude there, a lot more than 5,000. And he fed them with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. We're not going to get through the rest of this chapter tonight, so we're going to stop there. Next, we see another miracle, the telling of Jesus walking on the water. Another telling in the Scripture, in the Lord's ministry, that's often misunderstood. People joke about. I used to go to church with a guy that used to joke about he was practicing to walk on water, but he didn't have enough faith to walk across a pond yet, but he could walk. He had been practicing on mud puddles, and he was just joking about it. He wasn't serious, of course, but there are people out there actually who are serious about that. They think that at some point they're going to learn to walk on water. It's just like those that claim to be speaking in tongues. It's just the same thought process, if you will. People think that they can do the thing, and people take where Jesus tells us that we're to follow him and we're to be like him in this life. People take things too seriously and take things too far, not too seriously, but too far in some matters. We've not been called to heal and to bring people back from the dead and cast out demons and those kinds of things. Those things are over with. Those were finished with the apostles. speaking in tongues, and people talk about that today. Well, as far as we can take that as maybe if we're bilingual, we've learned more than one language. We might consider that speaking in tongues, which it truly is. But as far as walking on water, Peter tried it, and we'll see that next time. Peter tried it. Didn't work for him either, did it? Because he was a sinful man, and he began to doubt. And I think that should be the example to us, that we're not good enough to walk on water like the Lord was. We're not going to be able to do it. So we'll talk about that more